Hi, everybody. So first of all, thanks so much for staying. My name is Lisa Kaufman. I am a nurse practitioner. I am also currently unemployed, so I have nothing to disclose and no accompanying job title, but if you need a quality person, I'm on LinkedIn. So thanks very much for having me. I know that there's been a lot of scientific presentations. It's a little bit different, but I'm here to talk about the cost of quality and why it matters, and something I'm particularly passionate about. So the objectives of the presentation are to better understand the impact of poor quality and how we can better our ownership, individual ownership of quality to better advance new therapeutics. So how do we define quality? What is quality assurance versus quality control? What does it cost to bring a drug to market? Risk management. What are the key components of the cost of quality? What are the implications if we fail to meet quality standards? How do we mitigate risk? And why having a quality by design or quality ownership approach is so important. I want to give a special thanks and shout out to Mr. Joseph DeMasi, who was gracious enough to allow me to borrow some of his slides and images. All of my references are hot linked in the presentation, so I'm assuming you guys will get the slides. If you're interested in referring back to any of them, they're all linked into the actual presentation. So you guys are all seasoned. I know you've heard a lot of this before, but it's worthy of mentioning, and in particular because I've had a storied career in the sense that I've seen things that some people have gone their whole career without seeing. So it's important to sort of reflect back on what it is that we do, right? So what is pharmaceutical development? What is the goal? And when I first started in industry, we all got that end-to-end drug development training and what's the history of regulations and all of that. People don't get that anymore, and they really are coming into industry without a very good understanding of what are your, who your customers are downstream, who your predecessors are, and why this actually matters. And how do you develop a drug? How do you actually take a new chemical entity and bring it through the process to approval? There are approaches to pharmaceutical development in ICH Q8. Again, there's a link in the presentation. And with the new publication of ICH R3, there is much more of a focus on industry ownership for quality and sort of not this benign neglect, and we'll find it when it goes wrong or when somebody catches us. So why does it matter? I think I've just talked about this. Clinical trials are a fundamental part of clinical research that just supports our development of drugs. And trials with an inadequate design or poorly conducted trials can lead to issues with patient safety, potential risk outcomes yielding inadequate or unreliable evidence, wastes of resources, time, and money, especially for investigators and participants. And this includes things like inadequate bracketing when you're trying to find your correct dose level, right? Inadequate representation of your target population. These are things that we can address right up front and try to mitigate, as opposed to finding out after you're doing your analysis that there's a problem. And I think we'd all agree that's the least effective, cost-effective way of doing things. What's the difference between quality assurance and quality control? Quality assurance are all those planned and systematic actions that are established to ensure that the trial is conducted as it was intended. The data are generated, documented, recorded, and reported in compliance with GCP ICH requirements. Quality control of the operational techniques and activities undertaken within the quality assurance system. Sorry, I have to get something out of my visible, there you go. To verify that the requirements for quality of the trial-related activities have been fulfilled. Quality is all about being fit for purpose. When we conduct a clinical trial, we want to generate reliable data that's going to actually support the target marketing claims that the marketing team wants to go out and promote. You can't promote an indication that we don't have data to support. It's very important, again, to remember this. As well, the quality of information generated should therefore be sufficient to support good decision-making moving forward. And this is in advancing to our next phases in research. Multiple parties have responsibility for trial quality, and if you ask me, everybody's responsible. It doesn't matter who you are, we are all responsible. The participants, trial participants need to participate. We need them to be compliant. We need IRB oversight. We need our institutions to have good policies. We need the FDA for good oversight or any other health authority, IRBs, other party vendors, our CROs, et cetera. And remember, and I can't emphasize this enough, and I know it's very simplistic, but when you hire an external vendor, you are, as the sponsor, ultimately responsible for everything that they do. So hiring them with the belief that they're going to maintain the same level of oversight of your data is an error in judgment, and we only do that once, and then we don't do it again. And again, I came across a quality issue a few years ago where we had over 220,000 data points that hadn't been reviewed for over 2 years with our vendor. How does that even happen, right? But there was just no oversight. Well, you have to own that as the sponsor company. So again, we're all part of that process, and we all need to take ownership for that. Obviously, as we all know, drug development is an arduous, risky, complicated, and expensive endeavor. We work in a highly regulated environment. There's a competitive marketplace. But some of the big ticket items are the reduction in market exclusivity, as well as costs of goods and services, right? Lack of public support. We have the worst public image ever. If you're ever out there and you tell somebody you work in drug development, I'm sure they look at you like, you're the evil seed. And it's sad because we all contribute to the greater good for the most part. And it would be great if we had a better reputation with the public, and that's just unfortunate. The other thing is that, and we all hear these stats again, but it's worthy of mentioning, only about 12% of drugs that actually enter the marketplace ultimately are approved at the end of the day for market approval. And if those are sustainable, that's the add-on. I mean, you can get your drug all the way through approval and then find out once you're in your target population in a broader environment, right? You maybe studied in Viagra 500,000 patients, and immediately on approval that went out to 2 or more million patients. And then you're going to start to see things come out that maybe you didn't hit on in your trials. Really important for those post-approval studies, and again, to maintain that oversight. That's an ongoing responsibility. And you can go through all of that work and then have your chemical product, just fail out post-approval. So very unfortunate. But again, just trying to anticipate those things. In 2019, the pharmaceutical industry spent $83 billion on research and development. That's a staggering amount of money. When I first started, it's about 30 years ago, that money was something like $500 million. So again, that's just an exponentially enormous amount of money, and the risk is great. So this is why all of our small little startup companies, have so much on the line. And just adjusted for inflation and God knows what else, that's probably about 10 times higher than we spent back in the 80s. So again, the expected cost to develop a new drug, including capital costs and expenditures on drugs that fail to reach the market or get out there and fail post-approval, is estimated to range from anywhere from $1 billion to more than $2 billion. Again, we can definitely do better. Again, just an example of how our costs have increased over time. This is just from the 70s to the early 2000s, and it's just seems to be exponentially increasing every year. Sorry, I forget that this was in advance. So just to give you a little bit more granularity, the estimated total average capitalized pre-launch R&D costs for a new drug range from $161 million to $4.54 billion. This includes costs and expenditures for drugs that fail to reach the market. Therapeutic area estimates were highest for oncology drugs, and we're constantly getting into oncology research studies, and these average anywhere from 944 million to over 4.5 billion, largely due to the complexity and critical nature of the drug products and this patient population. In 2023, a study conducted by Tufts Center for Drug Development, those guys put out just great research, said that, they determined that a single day's sales is worth approximately $500,000. So you think about that, every delay that we have, every setback that we have to fix, you're losing $500,000 a day approximately in prescription or biologic sales revenue. And around 2024, studies found that across all therapeutic areas, the mean direct cost to conduct a clinical trial per day was approximately $40,000. And again, how do we develop new chemical entities when we're facing costs like this, right? I don't need to go through all these numbers. I think the point is very clear. I just want to buzz through here and see if there's anything. So again, nothing more impressive. A lot of these diagrams are, when you get a chance, take a real close look at them. Now, this one goes back to, again, early in my career, and we all looked at this, and see if I can get the pointer to work right. This, how long it takes, and why does that matter? Hold on a second. Sorry about that. So on average, only 1 or 2 out of every new chemical entity that enters research actually gets through that process successfully. And again, the biggest pain and agony comes in having your drug fail out in phase 3 studies or immediately post-approval. So the initial average on this when I first started out was that of 1 out of every 10,000 or so chemical entities actually made it through the process. That doesn't mean that they actually successfully made it to market. In one sample, researchers found that for every 100 drugs entering phase 1 trials, only about 60% advanced to phase 2, just over 20% advanced to phase 3, and only about 12 actually gained FDA approval. And I think it's actually lower. Costs tend to rise in each successive phase of development. We know that because we're exposing more patients and we add additional complexity as well as going into other countries and to broader populations. So again, we can talk about average spend per phase, 28 million for phase 1 studies. This is just your healthy volunteer studies, right? 65 million in phase 2 and over 200, almost $300 million in phase 3. Again, the cost of failure is tremendous. But who cares, right? Why? Why do we focus on all this? Why does this matter? I could sit here all day and blab about dollars and cents, and you can all go home and be like, thanks, that was great. But there was so much great science before that. But because it matters. So what are the factors that influence research and development spending? A lot of spending decisions are based on 3 main factors: the anticipated lifetime global revenues for the drug, expected cost to develop it, and the policies and programs that actually influence the supply and demand of prescription drugs. And again, I worked on great science for great small startups. That was wonderful, but there was no potential for making it a marketable product, right? There are certain things that you just can't do. So again, a lot depends on the global revenues of a new drug and what you can potentially get back from research and development. And that's a big deal. You want to be able to regain your investment. What are the policies that affect market exclusivity? And this is where we get to, again, really the big issue is market exclusivity. And I can't emphasize this enough. I have a really nice visual coming after this, but the federal government has adopted a variety of policies that grant periods of market exclusivity. It didn't used to be this way. You used to get your drug and you patent it, and that was it forever. And then there was the Prescription Drug Act and the ANDA Act, and all of a sudden there were restrictions on how long that you could have patent exclusivity to actually regain your return on investment. So in order to, sorry, I just lost my spot here, sorry. The return on R&D spending provided by higher prices for these products on release helps these companies get their revenue back into R&D. However, that incentive is not unlimited. Your market exclusivity clock actually starts the day that you file your IND or your biologic application. And that's why, that timeline to get to approval matters so much, and that's why we're all getting squeezed to do it faster and faster. So the primary way that the government grants innovators temporary market exclusivity is through their patent system. Most patents expired 20 years after the date which the patent application was filed. I thought it was 15. I need to confirm that, but let's use 20, that's fine. And many times this is filed long before you actually file your IND. And so again, that timeline just gets more and more compressed. So in recognition that a drug might spend several years in development, back in 1984, the government in fact enacted the Hatch-Waxman Act. Legislation allows for pharmaceutical companies to seek additional patent exclusivity if they can find additional indications or another justification. But again, that has to go through FDA review and approval. This also supports the development of generic drugs, right? Which allows costs to drop exponentially for people who just can't afford it or don't have insurance to get the actual product, the marketed product. So what's really critical, and this is what I have over here. So in order to get approval for an ANDA or abbreviated application for, let's say, a generic product, you need only one ADME study to demonstrate bioequivalence, and to demonstrate that whatever you change, so you take your marketed product and you run it through mass spec, and you figure out everything that's in there, and you change a binder or some other inert ingredient, and as long as you can demonstrate bioequivalence, you can get your generic approval. And so the cost of those studies are, in a few millions of dollars, and they can now jump on the back of all of your hard work and research and investment, and that decimates your patented product. Once things come off of patent, we all know this, you can't, unless you can only tolerate the approved drug, you can't get a generic, and you can't get the approved product, you have to take a generic, that's the law. So unless you have a good justifiable reason, they just won't let you. So this is the one that I was talking about. This is what I remember from back in my day, just showing again how much you start out with, how much money it costs, how this number decreases over time, and again, your market exclusivity timeline. And you have very little time to get that investment back. Not every drug that hits the market is going to be a blockbuster drug. So this becomes very critical. So let's talk a little bit about risk-based quality management, because this is what everybody's talking about now. And I think it's important to understand what that actually means. And that means an increased focus on integrating quality in every step of the process along the way. So quality risk management is a systematic process for assessment, control, communication, and review of the risks to the quality of the drug or medicinal product across the product life cycle. A model for quality risk management is outlined below. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it much bigger, but if you get a chance, you can open up the link and take a closer look at it. It's a really nice model for risk-based management. Other models may be used, but the emphasis is on ownership of quality every step of the way. Oh, I did go to slope. So this is a better representation here. So again, I'm very bad with the pointer, sorry. But it's talking about initiating a risk-based quality management approach from the get-go, and again, maintaining that through the life cycle of development. And anytime you hit up on a risk is addressing it right away, and then figuring out means of mitigation. What are the principles? The evaluation of risk to quality should be based on scientific knowledge and ultimately linked to the protection of the patient. That's our #1 priority. And The risk to quality includes situations where product availability may be impacted. And I don't know if anybody's gone through this. I worked on a product many years ago where the single only producer of this product had an explosion at the plant, and there were international shortages because there was no redundancy. So where does that put our poor patients, who are dependent? It can be something like B12. We once had a B12 shortage. Again, this costs patients their lives. How do these things happen? We need redundancy. We need to anticipate, that things can go wrong. And obviously, you can't anticipate everything. Things happen all the time. But again, making sure that you sort of be forward-thinking and document the risks ahead of time and address those as best possible, always sort of being forward-thinking. So again, I don't want to get too in-depth. I'm sure you're tired and want to get out of here. You can take the time to go through this. But the steps in summary are, to do a risk assessment. So really try to identify the potential hazards. Again, we can't anticipate everything. On 9/11, we had really critical biomarker samples sitting on a dock in New York City, and they sat there for 5 days. And we would have lost our whole study, but we had a FedEx guy who found dry ice and maintained our samples on dry ice for 5 days. These are things that, again, it was proactive, right? Everybody jumped in to help out. We got assistance, but ever since then, I've thought about these things, right? I've thought about what could happen, how do we package our samples? That's again, your biomarker samples could be your entire study. And that's patient involvement, that's cost, that's loss, it's the whole thing. So, but again, you can't anticipate everything. So you try to do your best to consider, what could go wrong, what's the likelihood that that's gonna happen, and then what are the consequences? And then just balancing those out. Again, if it's a low risk consequence, can you live with that? The next thing is to do a risk analysis, do an assessment of potential versus actual risk. And then, again, this sort of builds on itself easily. If you've identified the potential risk, is then doing an evaluation of whether or not it's critical or is it something you can live with. There's always going to be a level of uncertainty, things that we can't anticipate. But just, again, getting groups of people together. When you have your project team, get your representatives from every discipline at the table to think about what could happen and what we need to consider. Control those risks as best you can. And this is decision-making that involves everybody that you can, again, get to the table as best possible to analyze risks. And once you've identified something, determining whether you've got an acceptable risk level, what can we do to eliminate that, how can we balance the benefit, and then are we introducing new risks with the corrective actions that we're taking. So does everybody know about the lionfish issue that's going on in the ocean right now? Yeah, somebody took their lionfish that was in their aquarium and threw them in the ocean, not realizing it's a primary predator, and now they reproduce like wild, and now they've got people who are actually going out and trying to kill the lionfish because they're wiping out entire other fish communities. So again, this is that old butterfly effect. If you do something over here, it could have that effect over there. What a big deal, right? From one lionfish, and apparently they have no limits to reproduction and very few predators. So it's become a huge ecological issue. So again, considering whether or not what you're doing to correctively act might introduce additional problems. Defining your process, corrective action, again, assembling as much information as possible. Get a leader. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Thank you. Get a leader. Put somebody in charge. Not everything is going to be a democracy. Somebody has to make a decision. So, you can sit at a table and go round and round. At some point, someone has to make a decision, and it's really important that that person understands and listens to everybody, but then takes a course of action and moves forward. And always reassess. Always go back and reassess. terrible with this. This is a really nice, very light and not very great to look at here, but you can look at it later. Risk-based quality management process, step by step, and I know I don't have a bigger version, but it does a nice job of highlighting, waste versus, delay to market, what's above the water, what's below the water, and again, how do we address this? Risk reduction and risk acceptance, and I'm not on that slide, focusing on the processes that will really mitigate and not introduce additional issues, and then risk acceptance, and then moving forward, right? You have to sometimes make a decision to accept a certain level of risk, ensuring, again, that patient safety is always paramount and your number one concern. So what does it all mean? All this economic data, looking at drug development and what it costs, again, huge numbers. But what's important is that when we're developing drugs, our risks can actually increase by factors of any number, five times or more, when we fail to account for these costs and potential risks and address them up front. I'm not going to go through, they're outlined in detail in the slides. This is the cost of quality and 4 key components. I'm just going to buzz through real quickly. You've got prevention, appraisal, internal failure, and external failure costs. And I've outlined them in more detail here. Sorry, guys. I'm just trying to buzz through on time. We have direct costs. We've got indirect costs. Other costs, reputational quality. My boss used to say all the time, whatever you do, make sure I don't show up on the front page of the Boston Globe. I think that's, that's an important landmark. But again, it's our patients, right? What are the risks to the patient's health? And that's what we have to really keep in mind. So what can we do? How can we reduce poor quality? Quality by design. And that's a commitment by everyone in the organization, being dedicated to, again, when that timeline comes into play and you're getting squeezed, right? Now your data people took longer, your operations people took longer to close the trial. Now your data people are getting squeezed. Now your analyzing people are getting squeezed. It gets squeezed and squeezed because we still have to hit that target delivery date for filing. So again, taking a step back, trying to avoid errors, collecting data that's fit for purpose, reducing patient burden. These are, again, just a few of these. I'm sure you can think of many others, but avoid amendments. If I can't emphasize this enough, every time we introduce an amendment, we introduce confusion. It's a risk, and we have to be mindful of that. And it also takes time, right? So try your best to avoid amendments. Don't go into your study if you can, anticipating that you're going to have an amendment unless it's something that you just can't avoid. This is a great visualization of quality by design approach. And so what is the future? ICH E6R3 has taken a unique approach and is the only harmonized guideline among all of the regulatory global guidelines that really is taking a hard look at fit-for-purpose approaches to how we do our work, also addressing risk as we go along, and mitigating the burden to patients as well as to the system to make clinical trials more efficient globally and get products out to patients faster without compromising safety. So in summary, the cost of drug development is staggering and unsustainable. New regulations have increased focus on cost containment, but this only increases the pressure on R&D teams to move faster with fewer resources. Employing strategies that help identify risk early and methods for mitigating potential impact. Again, this can be found in every specialty and every discipline, and I'm sure that every person you work with knows, what that is in their particular area of focus. Quality by design approach to development where quality initiatives are built in along the way. There are checks and balances. And then a quality sort of right by me philosophy where each of us takes individual responsibility for delivering the highest quality work. And of course, all of us go into our everyday, with that expectation, but it's not falling back on that when that's the easy way out. Here are some regulatory references, which I'm sure you know. And that's it for me. So I don't know why my thank you. There you go. Thank you. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I hope that was helpful or interesting. Thanks.
By the way, Pastor Sam, this is the last call. If there's any questions that you would like to ask?
Anybody? Thank you so much. Thanks for staying. Thank you for having me.